Greetings from me, Reverend Michelle, but also from Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much that I have the opportunity to be amongst you today. I know we're just kind of jumping on, and some of us will be able to have video and some won't. We can utilize the chat. We also have YouTube streaming happening at the same time. So if you're participating through YouTube or some other format like that, please feel free to put comments in that you'd like to add to our conversation, and we can have folks from Metropolitan actually place them in the chat for the Zoom call so that we can incorporate those into our conversation. Why don't we take a moment to open with prayer, and then we'll jump right in. Thank you, oh God, that by the time we say your name or even think to pray or cry out or just cry, you are already amongst us. Thank you so much that spaces of community, digitally or in person, wide apart in a diaspora or close together around a table, can be made sacred because we gather together and because you join us there. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to come together and speak about words that have become sacred. Would you help us to see more of ourselves, more of you, more of each other, that we might be more and more and more who you've created and called us to be, and that this time together would be so much more than just checking a box to say we did it, but rather a way that we would be transformed in this world as well. We pray these things in the name of Jesus, who is our Savior and our friend. Amen. All right, y'all. Greetings, everybody. I'm starting to see videos come up. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So for the last so-and-so amount of time over the summer, I've been joining you at the noontime hour. For the rest of the summer, I'll be joining you for the noontime hour. So we'll be able to get into even more of a rhythm in that way. Last week, I wasn't participating in the noontime, but actually I had the opportunity to jump in for somebody else. So I was participating in the 7 p.m. hour for the same curriculum that y'all were doing last week at the noontime. So I feel like I didn't even miss a week. I feel like, you know, we've been journeying together and walking alongside each other, even though sometimes at different time periods. However, because this part of the curriculum together will be studying the book of Judges, and because last week was the introduction to the book of Judges, but also the genre of Judges, like what in the world is going on in that book of Judges, in addition to the actual content, right? Are there patterns we can see? Are there kind of initiatives that the writers want us to pay attention to as we're reading? So that was last week's work. And I was thinking that before we jump into the case studies for today, that we could take a look and refresh ourselves on the genre of the book of Judges, and also what you remember from last week, or what you think about when you think about the book of Judges. We can kind of get all of that out on the table, and then we can move into the case studies. So for those of you who are just jumping on, we're looking at the book of Judges with regards to the biblical text, but we're also taking a look at the book Holy Imagination, Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress Williams. This is an excellent theology book. In my own personal opinion, I think everybody at seminary should be reading this book. I think it's a wonderful way to take a look at the Bible front to back, but also be able to ask critical questions that allow us to interrogate sacred text, while also taking deep faithful looks at our own faith walk and what it means for us to consider our faith existentially, like as we live it, but also as we think about it, right? We don't have to drop our brains over here in order to be faith-filled people. So I highly recommend this book. If anybody is in charge of theology classes at seminary, anybody listening now, just jump on board with this book if you haven't seen it already. That's my own little pitch for this book. Okay, so let's start with kind of a recap. So regardless of whether you participated last week or not, think about the book of Judges as a whole. In the chat, let's start there. So in the chat, would you write something that you remember about learning within the book of Judges? Anything about the book of Judges? Okay, the story of Samson and Delilah, leaders after Joshua died, a mixed bag of leadership of Israel, series of missteps and forgiveness. Joshua just died and the people are crying out for a new leader. This is good. Of the persons who were judges, only Deborah actually served in the role. Right, if we have a particular definition of judges, Deborah is lifted up as one who serves in that kind of into and out of that definition particularly. Yep, these are good. Okay, one of in addition to all of these, right? So we have the time of Moses makes way for the time of Joshua, and then it's like, uh-oh, now what, right? And as we'll look at in the first case study, the first judge is the son of Caleb, I think. Is it the son or the younger brother of Caleb?
His son.
Younger brother. Othniel, younger brother of Caleb, right?
Jacob's nephew. Jacob's nephew.
Yeah, and Caleb is attached to Joshua. Right? So even there, you know, we're seeing this overarching cycle from Deuteronomy and before, but from Deuteronomy that we've talked about, right? That it's like, how is God the same God, right? And what is the carryover? What are the connections? As well as what's showing up differently. And then how do we talk about that, right? Many times church language shows up like God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Sure, that could fit on a bumper sticker, but it means something, right? It's pointing to something. It's pointing usually to how do we understand God being consistent, right? It's usually something about consistency and how we can rely on God to show up even in the midst of chaos. Usually that's when that saying shows up, right? So it's not just that it can show up on a bumper sticker. It's that we're trying to point to something about what can make our lives make sense. And what does this mean to be in relationship with the entity that we call God, right? So we've got these kind of connections that are showing up. At the very same time, the leadership of Joshua is a very different kind of leadership than what happens in the book of Judges. So the book of Judges is trying to portray, right, give us some insight into what's going on. And that leads me to talk about the pattern, right? The book of Judges is one of the books that a set of scholars have looked at over time and determined, hey, no matter what else is going on in this book, there's this pattern that continues to show up. And it's pointing to a pattern that was showing up in Israel, and it shows up in the writing of the book of Judges. Does anybody in the chat, does anybody remember anything about the pattern that shows up in Judges? Because we definitely need to like bring that to the table before we start looking at the case studies.
Upsy downsy, good, bad, all around.
Good, bad, right? There's a cycle of
Yes.
something,
And the
right?
people,
Forgetfulness,
Good, evil,
disobedience,
turmoil, all that. Brother Charles?
forgetfulness, disobedience, oppression, and deliverance, and right back into the cycle again into forgetfulness.
Yes, absolutely. And in addition to that, there's this crying out from the people, right? So the oppression gets so bad, the chaos gets so bad, the harm gets so bad that people are like, whoa, they get to their breaking point and they call out to God, right? So there's this pattern, and in the Holy Imagination book, the pattern shows up on page 73. And also, Brother Charles was bringing in some language that similarly shows up at the bottom of 74. So if you look at the bullet points on 73, that's the overarching pattern, right? The people did things, quote, the Lord saw as evil, right? Namely, worshiping other gods. So that's how it's going to, like, you're going to have some sort of language about the folks were acting out, and there was disobedience going on in the form of worshiping other gods. And God was like, I don't like that. Then the Lord became angry and allowed them to be defeated by their enemies. So if we remember back from Deuteronomy, there was this theology that said, if you are a good person, you're going to do the right stuff, God's going to be happy about it, and good stuff's going to happen to you. On the other side, if you're a bad person, you're going to do bad stuff, and God's not going to be happy about it, and bad stuff's going to happen to you. And then what did people do? They took that pattern and they started reverse engineering it. They said, if something good happens to you, it must be because you're a good person, God digs you, and you're doing good stuff, right? Because otherwise, how could the good things be happening to you? And they did it on the other side too. They say, hey, if bad stuff happens to you, you know why? Because you're a bad person and you're doing bad stuff and God is not digging you, right? So there are problems with that. And eventually in the Bible, we're going to see some pushback to that theology, right? What happens when we see bad stuff happening to good people, right? And this is a question that we wrestle with even today. So there are ways that gets some pushback even in the Bible, right? Some direct pushback to that. But at this point, we're still seeing that play out. So when folks are trying to understand why bad stuff is happening, they're utilizing that theology from Deuteronomy. They're like, whoa, some chaotic stuff is going on. So that must mean that the people are not doing the right thing and God's not happy with it. And guess what God is not happy with? Worshiping other gods, right? God's super not happy about that. So that must be it. Right? And then again, the consequences, right? How does that show up? How do they know God isn't happy? Well, we're not winning in battle anymore. Remember when Joshua was in play and we were just like pop, 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 right? We were getting everything done. Everywhere we stepped, that was our land. We had also, it didn't matter if other folk were living there, right? When we came in, stuff happened and things were going our way. Now though, stuff is not going our way, especially in battle. And now we're using that Deuteronomy theology to figure out what's going on, right? So then the people groaned under their oppression. The consequences of what was going on, the fact that they weren't winning in battle and all the different things that come with that, the folks were like, enough, we cannot bear this weight anymore. And eventually they cry out to God. They may have been trying to figure it out on their own. Maybe they're trying to do their own thing. what have you, but eventually they get to the point they're like, we can't do it anymore. We can't figure it out. God, we need you. We're dying under here, right? Then the Lord raises up leaders or judges who, as tribal chieftains, rescue them from the oppression. And that's what we're going to start looking at with the case studies, right? Who are these judges and what are they doing? Like, what is going on, right? It's not going to be the same story as we had with Joshua and other leader and Moses and that kind of thing. Something's changing, but there's something going on with these leaders, right? Then things were peaceful until the leader died. So the leader is creating some sort of like external constraint, external victory, that when that's removed, things go back to how they were. So it's a little bit different than the people rose up and they changed and transformed and they just, you know, went about their business in different ways, right? This pattern is opening up the possibility that it's only because there's an external leader there, some sort of external intervention from God that holds the order in place. And once that leader isn't there anymore, when the people now have to decide how they're going to live and what they're going to do, this cycle, the next thing goes right back, right? The momentum of it pops right back in. And now we're back to the cycle where things start going wrong. The consequences start playing out. They start losing in battle again. The oppression hits a certain point and the folk cry out, and then God intervenes again with another judge. Right? So the book of Judges is presenting this pattern of these cycles. And oftentimes it doesn't necessarily mean that it was like exactly 40 years, but the term 40 years usually means like a generation or a cycle. And I know during the 7 o'clock class last election, cycle, or the cycle of children going to. So when the Bible is talking about time period that happens.
Well,
Okay,
Michelle,
yes,
you're breaking up and pausing a lot. So most of the last thing that you said was sporadic.
I'm so sorry. I'm coming in from Baltimore City, and a lot of our weather is affecting internet. So I deeply apologize for that. I don't know what else to say other than deeply apologizing for, oh, it's good now. It seems like it's good now. Okay, so maybe because the word has gone forward, like, please allow this stability of internet. So the last thing I was saying is just talking about like cycles, right? There are ways we don't talk about, you know, like, and it was 40 years and then everybody knows exactly what that means, right? Other than like a literal 40 years. But we do talk about cycles of time, like the presidential election term cycle, you know, like 4 years for a US president, or a child goes to school from kindergarten or preschool through high school. That's usually like considered a chunk of time, right? If that person goes on to like trade school or something else, or college or whatever, that usually signals like a new section of time, right? So in the same way, when the Bible talks about 40 years, it's trying to just talk about like a section of time. This is a big old chunk of time for this particular leader. Okay, it seems we are still in that pattern. I'm looking at the chat now. We failed to care for God's land, and now the land is polluted and wildfires are rampant. Yes. Sister Leandra, do you want to add to that? I mean, it's very concise right there, but do you want to add to that?
I'm just keep pondering what God has in store for us now. You know,
yeah.
so much going on in the world. I'm wondering what cycle we're in.
Right. So one of the things we talked about at 7 o'clock, Sister Leandra, was whether or not, like, the way we think about people, like humanity, can influences, let's say that, influences the way that we think about some of this, right? So when we're looking at these cycles in the book of Judges, what I was saying is like a leader kind of comes in, straightens everything out, but when the leader dies, then there's the reverting back, right? People go back to their evil ways, right? If we look at humanity as ultimately good, like at the core, we are all good. And then sin comes in and we make choices and all that kind of stuff and whatever, but at the core we're still good. Then the way that we think about humanity, even the strategies we would use for justice would be different than if we thought at the core, people are horrible. Like they will just tear each other up if left to their own accord. And it's only through grace or external restraint or something else that people are held back from their base lowest desires, right? What do you think about that, Sister Leandra? Based on what you said, the book of Judges, like, what do you think?
I'm thinking that some people are not being held back, that they are in that raw state where they're doing exactly as they please and violating people, as you know, while all of this turmoil is existing in the world. And we have a lot of leaders that are just like, they almost seem like they're possessed with demons to me, some of their behavior.
I think
Right,
we're
and it-
kind of neutral. We're just kind of neutral. We come into the world and everything affects us. And sometimes that's for good and sometimes it's for bad. And so I'd rather give people a break and just say, we don't know, but we're all here and we're kind of stuck, really. And we make choices. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's I don't know.
So-
Is that begging the issue? I don't know.
So Sister Janine, you're bringing up kind of the blank slate theory, right? Everybody's born into the world with a blank slate and certain things happen to us and we make certain decisions and consequences of those things create the world, right? So it's highly free will oriented. It's highly neutral, as you're saying, right? We come in, it's not necessarily good or bad, it's just is. And then the consequences of decisions and whatnot create the circumstances that we live in and out of. Sister Leandra, you mentioned something about like, it's like they have demons within them, right?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
It's troubling for people to destroy like innocent babies and children, and I know this mental illness has a lot to do with it too.
Sure.
But then sometimes it's not mental illness. Some of the leaders, they claim that they are mentally stable, but their agenda seems like it isn't. So it's hard to determine, whether they're being motivated by evil forces or like they just made the wrong decision to follow things that will be destructive and to do things that are destructive. I'm confused.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think this is really an important place to consider, right? Because what I would argue, and again, I mean, this is this is not like the end all be all, right? Just because Michelle says something doesn't mean, this is just the way that I'm thinking about it, right? Like that's what this whole time is about. It's about, working this stuff out, wrestling with this stuff, right? It's not Michelle says something, that must be it. That's not, no, it's wrestling with these different things and then being able to claim, like, to stand on, this is what I believe, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, rather than just kind of floating along with the momentum of whatever, right? So Sister Leandra, when you say, when you bring in, like, it just seems like they're possessed by demons or something is wrong. For me, what that clicks for me is that humanity is good. And that in order for humanity to act like that, we must be possessed by something that is not good. You know what I mean? Like, otherwise we might say, look, some folks just think different ways. And some folks think that the way to get along in this world is just to take whatever they want, and whoever gets in their way gets in their way. And some folks have this drive to create good or to help other people or what have you, right? Some folks would say that has nothing to, like, the demonic thing is just an excuse for evil folks to do evil and not have some sort of tangible consequence, right? And again, if depending on how we look at humanity, it's gonna influence all these different things, right? We want to create justice about blah, 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 whatever it happens to be, right? If we think folks are ultimately good, we might try to tap into that. If we think folks are ultimately evil and they need an external constraint, we're going to be looking for accountability and structures for that and consequences to restrain people, right? Feeding into someone's ultimate goodness to do good is a much different strategy than constraint. That's not to say that both can't happen at the same time. And I think a lot of times when we're fighting injustice or fighting oppression, a both and approach is the one that gets it done. But if we're trying to think about like, well, what does it mean for me to live out my faith? Then how we think about humanness is going to be critical to that. What do you all think about that?
Okay. Yeah. I think go with that.
In the 7 o'clock hour, we talked about people that go back to help folks that they don't have any social responsibility toward, right? So like we talked about if somebody ran back in the face of danger to help somebody who vulnerable who fell down, right? So let's say everybody's running away from this danger, right? And somebody vulnerable falls down and everybody's just trampling over them, but somebody who doesn't have any connection. So it's not like their child, it's not their family member, it's not anybody that society would look at them and be like, oh my God, how come you didn't go back, right? Like they could just keep going and people could explain it, right? Well, they didn't have any connection. They were trying to save themselves. They were trying to make sure they got out so that they could be there for their family, all the things, right? But for some reason that person turns around, right? Recently there was a lot of video clips of runners in a race, right? And the first place runner collapses. The second place runner comes up and grabs that person and basically runs them across the finish line so that they finish in front of them, right? Now, technically, spirit of competitiveness, all that kind of stuff or whatever, even if that second place runner had run across the line and then gone back, still people would be like, wow, that runner went back, right? But they didn't do that. They gave up the spot that they would have had if they continued to run. Right. So they gave something up that was expected that they would do. Maybe they've been training a whole bunch of time and all the sacrifice and hours and the pain and whatever else that they did in order to be at that peak condition, that kind of stuff. We've got the Good Samaritan showing up in the chat now too, right? Domino's pizza delivery guy who rescued the girl in the fire, right? These are, and in the, I know I'm jumping around, but and in the Good Samaritan, right? The one who goes back is the one that's least expected to go back. Everyone's like, that person wouldn't go back, right? And that's the person who goes back. So when we're looking at the pattern of judges, we're looking at a very, it's a very this or that kind of presentation, right? Everybody in that spot was just evil, doing evil, all sorts of evil, right? Then an intervention comes and things clear up. And then as soon as that intervention is gone, right back in. We can talk about the human condition and know that there are usually exceptions to things, right? So it's not like, it's very rare that like 100% of the people would have been doing 100% of the evil and that kind of stuff, right? But we're talking about a way to get into a conversation, right? How do we think about the behavior of folks? How do we think about relationship with God? How do we think about what drives someone to do the good or to do that which is seen as evil. And then what does it mean for us eventually when we get to that place, right? Like, what does it mean for us to live as faith-filled people, either living into this innate goodness or countering an innate drive toward evil or selfishness or something like that?
Well, we had a situation in my building, we're a co-op, and for years we had the Van Ness neighbors, and we get prescriptions for people, you know, run errands, and we had a cradles to crutches, and we get stuff for them. Well, got a new set of lawyers who said, oh, nobody does that. You know, somebody could come in and, you know, bring something and they could steal something from you. And so there's an assumption that we're all, you know, thieves. And we've been doing this, you know, for like 30, 40 years, as near as I can tell. So, and I'm still mad about it because we never, ever had an incident. But they just said, oh, but something could happen, so therefore you can't do that. So I just, as you can see, I'm still pissed, but that's to me a real kind of a theological issue.
You know, Janine, we live in a world right now where everybody is really has a lot of fear, and that something bad is about to happen to them because of all of the violence going on, and people, that's their first reaction is, well, what could go wrong? You know, it's hard to see that things could go, you know, something good could happen, you know, for some people because of all of the evil going on in the world. People don't have that kind of spirit right now. A lot of people don't.
Yeah,
And I think that you would mention, I think sometimes that people that are doing things that are evil, that they don't acknowledge God. And because God is a God of consequences. And if you keep doing wrong, God will address it. And if you just feel that you're so big and bad, you can do as you please and harm and destroy people and things, God is going to eventually do something to address that situation with the person. And so I wonder whether people have lost their connection with God, you know, or something when they start, you know, engaging in evil activities. I'm very troubled right now about what's going on in Ukraine, because I truly believe that Putin, he says he's a Christian, and I keep wondering, how can he be a Christian if he's trying to annihilate an entire nation? And I feel that maybe he started out that way, but I believe he's lost his connection to God. He's not afraid of any consequences, at least. I don't know.
There's a lot of ways that we, humanity, right, human beings, will look at their actions and connect them with God, right? I proclaim to be a God-fearing person, right? I proclaim to be a Christian, whatever. And then I make this decision. I'm like, well, now I'm going to attach that to God. Since I'm a God-fearing person and I'm going to do this thing and I think this thing is right, then God must be for me, right? If we go all the way back to the beginning part of Joshua, when we talked about, you know, what does it mean to attach motivation to what you're doing to the will of God, right? But part of that, part of your actions is to go in and take land that already is inhabited by somebody else. Then where do you go with that, right? People will say like, oh, it's the will of God, right? Just like that's going to end the conversation right there without any kind of thinking about it or what have you. That part of what we're doing by studying the biblical text is asking those very questions so that we don't end up in a spot, and I mean that kind of literally and figuratively, we don't end up in a spot where we're just following our own inclinations and then just attaching those to the word, you know, the word and will of God as if they're just an automatic move. Because we've seen over time, and perhaps we've seen even in our lives, that much, much, much harm can come from that, you know, especially when we're not doing some critical interrogation of that. And that by by asking some of these questions of the text and of ourselves, we're at least getting to the place where we can start to articulate, well, why is that? Like, why do we think this particular act would be the will of God? What is it in the text that helps us see that? What is it over time, over the traditions of God interacting with people that we've seen, that this might reflect the character of God? Or are we using some of our critical thinking skills to just justify what we're trying to do because there's some language in a biblical text or a sacred text somewhere that looks similar, right? Like, part of what it means to be a person of faith is not just the faith part, right? Like these things aren't always going to make, logical sense, but it's also, what does it mean to live as a person who has claimed these particular traditions or testimonies as something by which we want to live? Like, I think maybe it was some time ago now, it may have been Sister Anne Marie who said I think it was something in the chat about when we were talking about like taking land that was already inhabited by somebody else in the book of Joshua. It was like, aren't there going to be some differences, once Jesus starts talking about this? And if this is what's going on in the book of Joshua, then I'm not sure I want to be attached to that God. Like, I'm not sure I want to be attached to a God who's going to snatch somebody else's land out from under them and then just say, well, this was the will of God. Sister Anne Marie, if I'm attaching that to you in error, first, let me apologize. And second, if you want to jump in, please let me know.
That sounds like I'm being pulled in.
Yeah, voluntold. Oh no.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm actually kind of glad that to hear this conversation. I didn't read the chapter yet, but I'm just itching to talk about this idea of who God is and what is a just act of God. When is it just? And can I just share briefly that I'm reading Where the Crawdads Sing for the second time. And I'm leading a book discussion with my church. And I don't want to ruin it for anybody who has not read it and plans to read it. Are you planning to read it?
Yes.
Okay, well then I can't talk about it.
Oh.
I can't at all. And Yvonne, Miss Bowling is saying, no. Don't tell me. Don't. But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say this one thing. It reads differently to me the second time. The first time I was captivated by the author's descriptive language. But the second time I'm reading it, I have a very different feeling about just. What is just? And I'm gonna shut up.
so now, not only do I have to read it, I have to reread it. Is that right,
Anne Marie, will you let us know when you have the book discussion?
Oh, we've been, actually we've been meeting. I'm meeting this Thursday. Okay. I can put the Zoom information in the chat if you're welcome to come. Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't have the book anymore. I had read it from the library, but we saw the movie yesterday. So,
yeah, we'll have to talk.
And this doesn't ruin it for anybody. But the book and the movie are very close.
Are they close?
Very close.
I wanted to go see the movie, but someone told me the whole ending. I said that ruined it.
Yeah, don't go see the movie if you haven't read the book.
Yeah.
Gotta read the book first. I would recommend read the book first. Yeah. I don't plan to see the movie because I don't like who they cast in the roles. They do not look like the images in my mind. Sorry.
Oh, good grief. Okay.
Hey.
Unrequested spoilers are not a just act, right?
On this topic, I mentioned last week that my birthday is August 25th. And I want to go see the arena stage new musical on Frederick Douglass. And so I'm looking into tickets for it. And I'd like to invite those of you who I consider my friends to join me, along with maybe some friends from New York Avenue and some other friends, to go on August 25th. Now, the tickets are about $45. They promised me it wouldn't be more. So it's expensive. But I wanted to see it from the minute I heard about it. And I thought, what better way to do it than to do it with the friends like I made here and with my New York Avenue. So if you're interested, can you put something in the chat so I can tell you? I need a tally by July the 28th, Thursday, July 28th.
Sister Janine, if you can put your request in the chat.
All right.
And how folks can get in touch with you, then folks can be doing that while we're finishing up.
Sorry to interrupt,
okay.
But it's
all
thanks
right.
about because the Claudette sings really sounds interesting. So thank you for that.
All right, so we have 2 case studies on the table for today. We have the case study of Othniel, which shows up in Judges 3. He's the first judge named in the book. And then we have case study number 2, which is the case study for Deborah. So the first, I don't want to just totally blow off the first case study. So I do want to give you a chance to jump in and talk about anything that that showed up as interesting or shocking or pertinent for you. The overarching, story is helping us see that pattern in play. Right? It's like even though the representation of that particular judge is very, very short, it's just like in and out, it shows up very quickly, but it shows the pattern. And like we talked about before, because it's Caleb, right? The younger brother of Caleb, it's got a connection to Joshua. So it's a connection from the past, but it's helping us see this new pattern that shows up. So he comes in against a king of double malfeasance, right? His name itself is translated as like double bad dude. And it shows how this cycle of 40 years comes through and works itself out right into the next pattern for the judge. So Brother Charles, please.
This is where I need to push back, at least in my mind.
Please.
Because it seems like the judges are linear. In other words, one follows the other one. It's not the same people having a judge, and then that judge dies, and then the same thing happens to that same group of people. As I understood it, and this is just briefly, when after Joshua died and the land of Canaan was allotted to each of the 12 tribes, you didn't have a united tribe. And so when we look at this first guy, he's fighting a person from Mesopotamia or someplace. And then when you get to Samson, he's fighting a Philistine. So it's different battles and it's different people. And so, but when you read the book, it sounds like it's linear, like it's the whole group of people in Canaan, in those 12 tribes, disobeying God. A judge comes in and relieves all of these people. 40 years later, they go back to the same site, but it's not always the same people doing the same thing. And so that transition for me is to say, were these the only judges? Because the other tribes in their lands were, because they didn't kill all the people. And that was one of the problems that God had with them. They intermarried, and that was disobeying God. So were there other judges in the different areas that were doing things that just weren't recorded? That's what I have to say.
Yeah, and I would imagine so, right? We have one recording of some stuff. So I think it's a brilliant move for you to highlight for us the reality that, you know, one of the things we can talk about a pattern is that it helps us see a pattern, but the way our brains work, this is just the way all human brains work, right? Once we start looking for a pattern, we're looking for the pattern. So that sometimes eclipses things that don't fit that pattern. And what I'm hearing you bring up is something that doesn't fit that pattern, right? It may be happening in a similar way, but it may be happening over here. There may be another judge over here. There may be something. So by looking at the story and only looking for the pattern, we will train ourselves to only see the things that fit the pattern. Whereas if we take it for what it is and say, this is one pattern that shows up here that we can see, we can also look for the other areas where it's not. And by taking your suggestion as a model, right, as an example, we can start looking for language that helps us see where it fits and where it doesn't fit, right? So by using, so the one that that I heard you bring up specifically was the 12 tribes not being together. So if they're not together, then is it realistic that there are going to be some offshoots of things going on? And it just so happens that Neil was the guy that made the cut for the writing, you know what I mean? So okay, so Brother Carlos says in the chat, I think the author said Judges is a patchwork of stories. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And again, I think this is critical, like looking at the pattern, but not letting the pattern destroy the reality of anything else going on, right? We can see, this is something that Sister Leandra was bringing up too, in a certain way. Like there are folks acting this way and folks acting this way, and sometimes there's something going on here, right? And by considering that, it becomes a little bit easier to say there are multiple things going on at the same time, and then what does that mean for us, right? It's not just of this or that our faith and how we're deciding to live into and out of it is going to require a little more nuance than that. And perhaps when we get to the only this or that, we start running into consequences of their own. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that forward. I believe that's so. And again, like if we did a whole historical study and we did a whole, you know, we did a whole like archaeology kind of deal, and we did a historical move to particular language of all the different kind of theology and stories that are coming into this one, and we tracked it, we'd be able to see some of those even more pertinently, or even more prominently rather. Then we've got a whole bunch of things going on with Deborah. Deborah's a woman, so that's like a big deal thing. I'm like, what? A woman judge? Come on. And then you say things like, yeah, but now it's 2022, and of course there'd be a woman judge or whatever, right? Except some gender stereotypes still remain today. And even the ones that aren't super blatant show up when we say, when we get surprised by something. That's usually when we get surprised or shocked by something, that's usually our own implicit bias showing up. So let's say we were on a plane, like on a flight, right? And, you know, the pilots come on ahead of time and they say, hey, we're the pilots and we're going to go to this spot and this is going to happen. It's going to be about this time. And don't worry, there's no turbulence, blah, 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 whatever they say, right? But sometimes there are two women pilots, right? The pilot and the co-pilot are both women. And you might talk to folks or even think to yourself, like, I don't have any problem with that, but it might still feel shocking. Like, really? Two, you say, right? And that's because there's a little part in there that still doesn't expect it. And the reason that we don't expect it is because we expect it to, at the very least, just be like one man and one woman. And so anything that's kind of takes us off, if I told you that my dog can catch a Frisbee, you would have certain ideas about what kind of dog I have, even if you've never seen my dog in real life or a picture of my dog, right? If I told you that my dog has a YouTube channel where my dog does math problems, you might be like, right, show me. Because our implicit bias is like, that's not probable. It might be possible, maybe, like maybe if I decide to trust you, Michelle, then I can bridge the gap between what I'm thinking. But that shock, that initial like, nah, that's because our implicit bias has taught us or told us or shaped us or molded us to make us think that, right? So the very first thing about the judge, Deborah, is that she's a woman, and that's already setting the stage, right? One of the things that we can take from that is that God does things that we might not expect. And that has implications for our faith, right? Even though we're talking about like a gender thing right now, right? Just the idea that God could and would do something that is unexpected, even to the people who are faithfully following this God, that has implications for us today. What do y'all think about that? You think I'm just making too much of it?
I don't think so at all. I think it's then and now, unfortunately for now, it's still unusual, and it would have been even more unusual in biblical times, because even if the women were doing things in great numbers, they surely weren't given credit. And I doubt that they were, since it's not recorded.
Yeah. So Sister Marcia, what do you think about what Brother Charles said before, right? Brother Charles was like, this is probably, you know, kind of a certain smattering of judges that we have here, right?
Yeah.
But it's probably not all of them, and it's probably showing up in different ways. When I think about what you just said, like, there's a possibility that there were more women judges out there. They just didn't make the cut, right?
Right.
What does that mean for us today, though? What does that mean what does that mean to be a faith-filled person that takes like that part of the conversation seriously?
We need to expand our thinking.
Yeah, and that it's not so easy to do that sometimes.
Yeah.
Because we've already decided this particular thing is the way that God works. This is God's will. So this is one of the questions that I keep bringing up week after week, because this is something that I am, you know, I'm wrestling with this too, right? Where do we come down on whether or not we're living into and out of our faith in a faithful way? How do we know this? This comes back to Sister Anne Marie's comment too, right? How do we know that act is just? Because folks over and over and over again, especially when folks have power, whether they snatch it or earn it, will then surround themselves with folks that agree with them, right? And then perpetuate whatever that thought process is.
Oh, yeah.
So how do we, what's the check and balances to that? No pressure, just answer like a deep, deep theological and philosophical question.
Well, don't you just kind of have to look at what they're doing in terms of how they're treating people? And the other thing is that I think what we've learned with the Old Testament and then the New, that the whole thing is expanding. in terms of what's good and what's bad and who's on first and who's on second, and is it trying to expand God's love? I guess that's just off the top of my head the best thing I can think of.
Right. And I think part of our call as people, right? So Metropolitan is about liberation, service, and worship, right? Liberation, right? Justice. How do we create justice? How do we protect it? How do we sustain it? How do we dismantle oppression? How do we do those things, right? There are people right now who are treating folks in some kind of way that we would claim is evil, while they simultaneously are claiming that it's God's will. And there are all sorts of justifications for why it's happening and biblical texts that are attached to it and blah, 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 right? Then there are things that we would do and other folks would be like, that's just bringing chaos all over the place. And that's not blah, blah, blah. And here's why it's harmful. And this is what y'all are doing. And right? There's got to be a place that we stand. Right? It's one thing to say, we just look at the actions and know, right? Or we just look at the actions and it comes to the surface, or we'll be able to decide when we see it or whatever. But the way the world works with real actions and real consequences to those actions, there's going to come a point where folks have to stand somewhere. They got to stand somewhere. Now, a lot of times what happens is we'll stand somewhere, but not articulate why and how we're standing there. We'll stand there and say, this is based on my faith. Well, that's what everybody's saying. So how, and that doesn't, there's no direct connection between saying I'm doing this because my faith tells me so and an actual outcome that leads to good. The good, however we define that. So part of what our faith challenges us to do, part of what doing ethics or being an ethical person challenges us to do, is to name very specifically, how do you know, right? Some folks will start with like a general kind of terminology. It must be life-giving. Okay, life-giving. Well, what are some examples of that? Right? Like, well, it has to be life-giving and it can't oppress another person while it's being life-giving over here, because otherwise it's not life-giving. Okay, well, what defines that? Right? And then folks start to get real uncomfortable because a lot of times we're not challenged to name those things specifically. You end up with a whole bunch of like both and kind of stuff and different decisions being subsumed under other decisions, or language being so vague that you might as well be talking about the weather, right? You can have conversations about any particular, you can name the workshop or the session or whatever you want to name it. It can be the anti-oppression to definitely end this particular something. And y'all can have conversations, or we can have conversations about it that are so vague and so into the by and by that literally nothing ever gets done. So if we're going to talk about liberation, let's just say, right, because we're coming out of Metropolitan, if we're going to talk about liberation, then we've got to start getting clear about what liberation is. And what makes us think that the God we keep hanging out with is about the liberation too, right? And then once we start naming some of that, then we can at least take a step. We can take a step and say, this is why I'm doing this thing. And these are some strategies that will help us get there, rather than just kind of like, let's just have a big discussion about it. And then, everybody just goes to the next committee meeting or whatever, right? We just had a meeting about the meeting. So what does that mean for us to look at the book of Judges, to look at case studies where there's a pattern, but like what Brother Charles was saying, it's like the pattern doesn't include everything. So we got to keep that in mind too, right? How does the pattern start to lull us into a foggy place? But then also we've brought up, and we barely touched the surface, that God is going to show up in ways that we don't expect. And it might be that we absolutely expect the women pilots, right? Or the woman judge, or whatever the thing is. It may be that we expect that. But what do we do? And how do we know that we're living into and out of our faith when God shows up and challenges us with something that does counter our implicit bias? How do we do this work in faith-filled ways?
I think we have to draw on our personal experiences.
Mhm.
And as you talked about that, and I think about all of the things that, and I'll just use myself and my family as an example of the things that we've gone through. I could just use the example of my son being in sickness, that through all the things that he went through, all of the oppressive parts of the system that would have denied him certain services, certain equipment, certain nurses, certain doctors, but God stepped in. And when people were saying, well, you're not going to be able to get that, and then God showed up and he did get it. And people would say, well, wow, how did he get that $100,000 bed with no money? And I would say, I don't know, but it was delivered. And although it was over, so I had to say that I used my experiences. Not only just that, I was listening this morning, and when you brought in that point about the land being taken over, I was looking at the news, and Bruce's Beach, I don't know if you know, if you saw that, Bruce's Beach was a Negro-owned beach in California, where these people came from Puerto Rico, had bought the beach, had bought the land, were going to set up a compound and everything for their families, for people to come, because Negroes could not at that time go to any beach. And then the Ku Klux Klan and the government came and took it away from them, eminent domain, took it away from them. Took the land over and said that they were going to build this fancy place for everybody to come to, which they didn't. Ultimately, made it a government institution. Now, 100 years later, the descendants of that land are finally getting that land back, and the government now has to pay them $20 million for it. But how much more could they have earned if they had kept it as a resort? But, God said 100 years, and I kept thinking, okay, God's time is not my time. I would have thought next year, if they took it away from me, hey, I want my land back right now. But 100 years later, now the descendants of those people have that land, that beach back. They are now leasing it to the government. So, I just say you have to use your own experiences of faith, and you have to rely on that. And the things that happened with Deborah, look what happened to Sarah. Who would think a woman 89, 90 years old would have a baby? That's an act of God. And God telling her, you're going to have a baby. You say, you crazy. I would have said that. But I think God does show up in ways that are not the ways that we think he or she should show up. And when it happens, it's like, and it did happen, Deborah did come, Sarah did have a baby or whatever, Rahab did, save her family by letting the spies come in. So it's just, we don't think like God. And so we don't have that pattern that, it should happen this way, because we're thinking our way, but I don't think I know we don't have the clear picture of how God thinks. Because I say sometimes, you funny, you just, God, you really are a funny dude, whatever.
Dr. Bowling, I think, yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, I'm finished.
Yeah, I think, part of what you're talking about is like how we learn from each other, right? And if we're learning from people with different experiences, then it allows us to see and hear how God is interacting with different people in different ways. It hears about the way different folks struggle with different things, the way systems oppress different people based on, you know, race or gender or any of the other spheres of oppression, right? And that when we are in true fellowship with one another and are really hearing each other in that way, in ways that lead to action, right? Not just like, oh, we're just going to talk about it some more. When we do that, we're getting a bigger picture of what needs to be fixed, how justice and liberation can actually happen. The folks who are direct targets of any particular oppression are always the best suited and best capable of knowing exactly what is going to tear it down. But what usually happens is the folks who are already protected from that oppression are the folks sitting around a table saying, this is what we're going to do, right? So if we start by having some critical conversations, by sharing testimonies, by looking at these texts and thinking more broadly about like what isn't there, you know, based on how we know, right? What is in the text? How does our experience come to bear? And how can we honor who we are without oppressing someone else while we're trying to do it? How do we define the difference between repairing oppression that's already happened and separate oppression that is happening on top of it, right? Those are ways that we can get to what does it mean to live faithfully, right? I know we're over 1 o'clock. This is next week, we're going to talk about the other case studies. And since we've already talked about the pattern and done kind of a recap thing, we can jump right into the case studies for next time. So next time is the case study for Gideon and also Samson. So if we can be looking at all 4 case studies, and then we can bring some things forward about that, we can pick this conversation up next week. Thank you all so much. There's been some comments in the chat coming up about folks who are struggling with this very thing. Like, how are we faith-filled people? How do we hold on to our faith when there's the evil going on and folks making these horrifying decisions and sometimes when evil feels like it's being unchecked, right? It's just having its way. How do we remain faith-filled and how do we remain faithful as we continue that in ways that are honorable, right? Honorable to us too, because we count too. So thank you for bringing forward your comments in the chat. Thank you for bringing forward your comments in this discussion. And honestly, I can't wait until next week already where we get to pick it up again. Thank you for allowing me to be amongst you today. Is there anybody who would like to pray to close our time together?
I will.
Okay, thank you so much.
Where did I go? Oh. Let us take a deep breath and exhale. And breathe in again. And exhale. And breathe in the love of the God, the Father, Mother Nature, of all of living things, of all of our minds and our imaginations and our dreams and our quests. We give our God thanks for this community, for this fellowship, for this discussion, for our leader. Be with all of us as we struggle, learn, grow, change, and accept this moment. May you be with all of us and our families and extended families this day and every day moving forward. We ask for your presence. Thank you. In the name of your Son who graced us with his presence, Jesus Christ, we all say, amen.
Amen. Thanks, y'all. Thanks, y'all
you.
so much.
Thank
Take